The air inside St. Peter's Basilica was filled with echoes that seemed to hang in the high ceilings long after a note had faded. It was early morning, and the sunlight filtering through the stained glass painted the marble floor with colors that moved like gentle waves. The papal choir had gathered for an important rehearsal before the Easter Mass, one of the most celebrated events in the Vatican calendar. Every note mattered, every chord carried a weight of centuries of faith and beauty. At the far end of the grand hall, Pope Leo XIV quietly entered. He was known to be a gentleman, not given to anger or display. His deep eyes, framed by age and wisdom, had seen decades of devotion, and music was one of the few things that still moved him deeply. He often said that sacred music was the closest thing to prayer without words. Today he had come not to lead but to listen, to see how the choir sounded before the holy day. Among the choir stood a new face. A young pianist named Lorenzo Benedetti had been invited to accompany the choir for this special performance. Lorenzo was known across Italy for his remarkable talent. He had played in grand halls, dazzled audiences with his skill, and won competitions since he was a child. But what he possessed in talent, he lacked in humility. Many admired him, but few could say they liked him. When Lorenzo sat at the grand piano placed near the choir platform, he exuded confidence. His posture was perfect, his expression calm but proud. He looked around at the older choir members with an air of superiority, tapping the keys softly, as if to remind everyone of the brilliance waiting beneath his fingers. The rehearsal began. The choir sang in Latin, their voices blending in beautiful harmony. Lorenzo played the accompaniment flawlessly, perhaps too flawlessly. Every chord was crisp, every arpeggio too polished, as though he was performing for a concert hall rather than serving the spirit of the Mass. The Pope listened quietly from his seat near the altar, hands folded in his lap. After a few hymns, he gently raised his hand. The music stopped, and the choir turned toward him respectfully. "My children," he said in a calm voice, "the sound is beautiful, but perhaps we can make it a little slower, more reflective. This hymn speaks of mercy, and mercy is not something rushed." There was a small pause. The choir nodded, ready to follow his guidance. But Lorenzo's eyes flicked toward the Pope, and he couldn't resist. With a faint smirk, he said, "With all respect, Your Holiness, music must live. If it becomes too slow, it dies. Perhaps the Church should keep up with the times." A stunned silence fell over the room. The choir members froze. One of the older sopranos lowered her sheet of music, her eyes wide with disbelief. The conductor's face turned pale. No one spoke. It was unthinkable to speak to the Pope in that tone, especially in this sacred place. The Pope did not look angry. Instead, he gazed at Lorenzo quietly, his face unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he smiled softly. "Ah," he said kindly. "You may be right, my son. The times do move quickly. Please continue as you see fit." The choir exchanged confused glances. Lorenzo gave a faint nod, feeling as though he had won a small victory. He placed his hands back on the piano keys and began again. This time, he played even more boldly, adding flourishes and runs that were technically brilliant but out of place. His fingers danced with pride, not prayer. The music filled the vast basilica once more, but something sacred was missing. The voices of the choir struggled to keep pace with the new rhythm. It sounded impressive, but empty, like a painting with no soul. The Pope listened without interruption. He didn't stop the music again. When the piece ended, he simply closed his eyes for a moment, then whispered, "Thank you." The rehearsal went on for another hour. The choir members were uneasy. They sang carefully, avoiding eye contact with Lorenzo. When it ended, they bowed to the Pope and began to leave quietly, whispering to one another as they gathered their sheets. "He shouldn't have said that," one tenor muttered. "I thought His Holiness would dismiss him on the spot," said another. "But did you see? He didn't even frown," someone else whispered. Lorenzo, for his part, seemed unfazed. He walked past the Pope, bowing slightly out of formality, and left the hall with his head held high. Later that evening, As the sun set over Rome, the Pope sat in his private study surrounded by shelves of old manuscripts and letters written by saints and composers. The room was quiet except for the soft ticking of an antique clock. His secretary entered and asked gently, "Your Holiness, shall we seek another pianist for the Mass?" The Pope smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Let him play." "But he was disrespectful," the secretary said cautiously. "He embarrassed you before the entire choir." Pope Leo turned his gaze toward the window where the last light of the day lingered. "Yes," he said softly, "but arrogance is not evil. It is only blindness. Sometimes a man must be shown the light, not told of it." The secretary nodded silently and withdrew. That night, Lorenzo returned to his apartment overlooking the Tiber River. He replayed the moment in his mind, the look on the Pope's face when he had challenged him. There had been no anger, no humiliation, just calmness. It unsettled him more than if the Pope had shouted. He poured himself a glass of wine and sat by the window, staring at the city lights. He told himself he was right. The church's music was too old-fashioned, too bound by rules. He believed he had only spoken the truth. But somewhere deep down, a small voice whispered that perhaps he had gone too far. He ignored it. The next morning, when Lorenzo arrived at the basilica for another rehearsal, the mood was different. The choir members avoided his eyes. The conductor barely spoke to him. Yet when he took his seat, the Pope entered again, calm as ever, smiling as if nothing had happened. As the choir prepared to sing, the Pope raised his hand and said, "Before we begin, I would like to ask our pianist to meet me tomorrow morning, alone, in the old piano room behind the chapel." Lorenzo's hands froze on the keys. The old piano room was rarely used. It was said that popes of centuries past had practiced there, and that it held instruments untouched for generations. "Yes, Your Holiness," Lorenzo said quietly, unsure of what to expect. The rehearsal went on, but his mind was elsewhere. The Pope gave no sign of displeasure or tension. He listened, smiled, and occasionally nodded. Lorenzo began to feel even more confused. Was this some kind of test? When the session ended, he approached one of the choir members, a kind old man who had sung in the papal choir for more than 40 years. "What is this piano room?" Lorenzo asked. The man's eyes lit up with quiet reverence. "Ah, that place," he said softly. "It's not just a room, it's history. Many popes went there when they needed to pray through music. Some say the air there still carries the sound of faith itself." Lorenzo frowned slightly. "Faith doesn't make you play better." The man smiled sadly. "Perhaps not. But it makes the music mean something." That night, Lorenzo couldn't sleep. The more he thought about the Pope's calm reaction, the more uneasy he became. He was used to applause, to admiration, to people telling him he was extraordinary. But here was a man who had every reason to be offended and yet showed no pride, no judgment, only gentleness. He tried to practice to distract himself, but his fingers felt heavy. The melodies that once came so easily now sounded hollow. He stopped playing and sat in silence, listening to the faint sounds of the city. The next morning, when he walked through the Vatican corridors toward the old piano room, he felt an unusual nervousness in his chest. The hallways were quiet, and the smell of incense lingered faintly in the air. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows, catching dust motes that danced like tiny stars. When he reached the old wooden door, he paused. Behind it, he could hear faint notes, slow, delicate, full of feeling. He pushed the door open gently. There, sitting at a grand but time-worn piano, was Pope Leo XIV. His white robes were simple, and his fingers moved slowly over the keys. The melody was old, familiar, and hauntingly beautiful. Lorenzo stood frozen at the doorway, watching. The Pope looked up and smiled warmly. "Ah, my son," he said softly. "You came." Lorenzo stood silently at the doorway, unsure if he should speak. The Pope continued playing the piano, his fingers moving gently over the worn ivory keys. The sound was not loud or showy, but there was something in it, something that made the air in the room feel alive. Each note lingered, as if it carried a prayer. When the melody ended, Pope Leo lifted his hands slowly from the keys and turned toward Lorenzo. His eyes were calm, kind, and filled with something that made the young pianist feel small, not belittled, but humbled. "Come closer, my son," the Pope said quietly. "You play beautifully, but beauty alone is not enough." Lorenzo stepped forward slowly. The piano looked ancient, its wood darkened by time and its surface scratched by the years. He had never seen an instrument like it. The Pope motioned for him to sit beside him on the bench. Lorenzo hesitated. It felt strange sitting next to a man he had challenged only a day before. But the Pope waited patiently, so he finally took his seat. The bench creaked softly under their weight. "This piano," the Pope said, running his hand over the wood, "was built more than a century ago. Its keys have been touched by men who never played for applause. They played for something greater, something they couldn't see but they felt here." He pressed his hand gently over his heart. Lorenzo glanced at the Pope's wrinkled hand and said quietly, "Music is meant to move people, to make them feel." "Isn't that enough?" The Pope smiled faintly. "It can move people, yes. But what is it moving them toward?" He looked at Lorenzo. That is the question every artist must answer. Lorenzo looked down at the keys. For a moment he didn't know what to say. The silence in the room was deep but peaceful. The Pope began to play again, this time a simple hymn. His fingers trembled slightly with age, but the sound was full of emotion. The notes were soft and uneven, yet they carried warmth that filled the space. Lorenzo felt something inside him stir, something he hadn't felt before when listening to music. When the Pope stopped, he said softly, "You see, my son, sometimes perfection kills the soul of the music. Sometimes it is the imperfection, the hesitation, the breath that makes it human." Lorenzo frowned slightly. "But technique is important. If a musician doesn't master his craft, how can he express anything?" The Pope nodded. "Yes, technique is the body, but spirit is the heart. Without the heart, the body cannot live." He stood slowly and walked toward the window. The morning light streamed in, casting a golden glow over the room. "When I was young," he said quietly, "I also wanted to impress. I thought that to serve God through music meant to be the best. But one day I met an old organist who played so poorly that even the choir winced. Yet when he played, I wept, and I did not know why." He turned to Lorenzo with a soft smile. "I realized then that it was not his hands that moved me, but his heart." He played not for men, but for heaven. Lorenzo sat in silence. He didn't know how to respond. His mind went back to all the times he had played for crowds, for judges, for standing ovations. He had always felt proud, but never peaceful. The Pope's words stayed in his mind like echoes that wouldn't fade. After a long pause, the Pope said, "Play something for me, Lorenzo." "Anything you like?" Lorenzo straightened his back and placed his hands on the keys. He chose a piece he had written himself, a showpiece filled with fast passages and grand chords. As he began to play, the room filled with energy. His fingers moved flawlessly, every note crisp and powerful. When he finished, the Pope nodded slowly. "That was magnificent." Lorenzo gave a small smile. "Thank you, Your Holiness." But the Pope added softly, "Do you know what I heard?" Lorenzo looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I heard your hands," the Pope said gently. "But I did not hear your heart." The words hit him harder than he expected. He looked away, pretending to adjust his sleeve. "Try again," the Pope said. "But this time do not think about playing. Think about feeling." Lorenzo hesitated. "Feeling what?" "Anything," said the Pope. "Sadness, hope, forgiveness, whatever your soul holds at this moment. Let it speak through your hands." Lorenzo took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He touched the keys again, this time slower. He didn't play the same piece. Instead, he began to play a melody he used to play as a boy, a simple tune his mother had taught him when he first learned the piano. It was clumsy and uneven, but it carried something honest. As he played, something inside him softened. He remembered his small village, the sound of rain on the roof, his mother humming softly beside him. For the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about how perfect it sounded. He just played. When the last note faded, the Pope remained silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Now, my son, that was music." Lorenzo looked down, his eyes stinging. "It was nothing," he whispered. The Pope shook his head. "It was everything." They sat in silence for a while. The Pope's presence was calm, like a gentle tide that didn't need to force anything. It simply was. After a moment, the Pope said, "Do you know what pride does to a musician?" Lorenzo said nothing. "It makes him deaf," the Pope continued. "He can hear his own playing, but not the silence around it. Music is born not just from sound, but from the space between sounds. The silence is where the soul speaks." Lorenzo nodded slowly, his thoughts heavy. The Pope's words were unlike anything he had ever heard. They weren't rules or lessons. They were truths. The Pope smiled faintly and added, "When you play tomorrow, do not play for me. Do not play for the choir. Do not play even for yourself. Play for the one who gave you the gift." Lorenzo looked at him and said quietly, "I don't know if I can." The Pope placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You already have, my son. You just don't know it yet." The old man's hand was warm, steady. For the first time, Lorenzo felt something close to peace, a stillness that came not from success but from understanding. The Pope then turned back to the piano. "Come," he said, smiling. "Let us play together." They began to play a simple duet, one of the old church hymns. Lorenzo followed the Pope's lead, this time not trying to outshine or perfect. He simply listened. The Pope's tempo was slow, almost hesitant, but it carried a tenderness that made each note feel alive. Their sounds blended beautifully, youth and age, technique and faith, pride and humility. Lorenzo found himself breathing in rhythm with the music. It felt natural, effortless. When the last chord faded, the Pope said softly, "You see? Music can be a prayer if the heart is pure." Lorenzo nodded. He didn't speak because words felt too small for what he had just felt. As he stood to leave, the Pope said, "Come to the rehearsal tomorrow. The choir needs your hands, but more than that, they need your heart." Lorenzo bowed his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Holiness." As he walked out of the old piano room, he felt different. The echo of their playing followed him through the corridors. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a performer. He felt like a student again. Outside, the Vatican gardens were quiet. Birds sang in the distance, and the morning light had turned soft and golden. Lorenzo stopped near a fountain and sat on a stone bench. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had earned him fame, wealth, and applause, and yet they had never felt as heavy as they did now. He realized how far he had drifted from the reason he began playing in the first place. He remembered being a child, closing his eyes as he touched the piano, amazed that sound could make people feel something without a single word. That wonder had been buried under pride and ambition. Now, with a few simple words and an old piano, the Pope had uncovered it again. That night, Lorenzo didn't go out. He didn't practice his usual routines or study his sheet music. He sat quietly in his small apartment, listening to the city sounds outside his window. Then slowly he began to play the same hymn they had played together. This time there was no audience. No spotlight. No applause. Just him, the piano, and the quiet truth of what music really meant. And as he played, for the first time in years he smiled, not because he was proud, but because he finally understood. The next morning came quietly. A soft mist hung over the Vatican gardens, and the bells from St. Peter's Tower rang gently through the air. Lorenzo walked slowly through the marble corridors, the echo of his footsteps mixing with distant whispers of prayer. Something inside him felt different. The arrogance that once carried him into every room now felt like a heavy coat he no longer wished to wear. When he reached the rehearsal hall, the choir was already gathered. Their voices drifted faintly through the doors, warm and steady like sunlight through stained glass. He paused for a moment before entering, his hand resting on the cool brass handle. He took a breath and stepped inside. The faces that turned toward him were mixed with surprise and curiosity. The same man who had once walked in with a proud smile now carried a softer expression. Even his posture was different, less stiff, more humble. The conductor gave him a polite nod, and Lorenzo responded with one of his own, quietly making his way to the piano. Pope Leo XIV was not there yet, but his chair sat waiting near the altar. The morning light poured through the high windows, and the air was thick with the scent of incense. The choir was practicing a hymn in Latin, their voices rising gently in harmony. Lorenzo listened for a moment before placing his hands on the keys. When he began to play, the sound was different from before. It wasn't about speed or perfection. It was simple, warm, and patient. His fingers seemed to move with a quiet understanding rather than pride. The choir noticed it immediately. Their voices softened to match his new rhythm, and the entire sound of the room changed. The conductor turned toward him and gave a small smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't need words. It simply said, "Yes, now it feels right." A few minutes later, the large wooden doors at the back of the hall opened, and Pope Leo entered. The choir stood in respect, and Lorenzo rose as well. The Pope raised his hand gently, signaling them to continue. He sat down, listening carefully as the hymn went on. He didn't speak until the song ended. Then with a soft smile he said, "I see we have found our balance." The choir looked at one another, relieved. The tension from the previous days seemed to melt away. Lorenzo bowed his head slightly. He didn't say anything, but the Pope's words meant more to him than any applause he had ever received. After the rehearsal, the Pope walked over to Lorenzo. "You played beautifully today," he said. "Thank you, Your Holiness," Lorenzo replied quietly. The Pope's eyes were kind but curious. "Tell me, my son, how did it feel to play this morning?" Lorenzo thought for a moment before answering. "Different," he said. "I wasn't thinking about being heard. I was just listening." The Pope smiled and nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "Now you are beginning to understand. Music is not about filling space with sound. It is about creating silence that speaks." Lorenzo lowered his eyes. The Pope's words always carried a strange power, simple yet they reached deep inside. That afternoon, the Pope invited him to join him in the gardens. The air outside was fresh, and the sound of the fountains mixed with the chirping of birds. They walked slowly along the stone path lined with olive trees. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, the Pope said, "You remind me of someone I knew long ago." He was a young organist full of fire and confidence. He thought faith was a prison for art. But one day, life humbled him, and he found that faith was not a cage. It was the wings that lifted his art higher. Lorenzo smiled faintly. "And what happened to him?" The Pope chuckled softly. "He became the happiest man I ever met." Lorenzo nodded but didn't answer. He thought of his own life, the endless performances, the applause, the fame. He had always thought those things would make him happy. Yet now, standing in the quiet of the Vatican garden beside a gentle old man, he realized that peace was something he had never truly felt. They stopped near a small stone bench, and the Pope sat down. "Do you know why I asked you to come here?" he asked. Lorenzo shook his head. "Because I wanted you to see this place," the Pope said, looking around. "Everything here grows slowly. Nothing rushes, yet everything finds its time. Music, faith, love, they are the same. When we hurry, we miss their meaning." Lorenzo followed his gaze. The olive trees were old and strong, their branches twisted by time but still full of life. He understood what the Pope meant. All his life he had rushed, to be better, faster, more famous. But in doing so, he had forgotten to listen. "Your hands," the Pope said gently, "and were given a gift. But gifts must be shared, not shown. Remember that." Lorenzo nodded quietly. That evening, he returned to his apartment. He didn't touch the piano right away. Instead, he sat by the window watching the lights of Rome flicker in the distance. The city looked softer now, less noisy, less proud. He could still hear the Pope's voice in his mind. Music is not in the notes, but in the silence between them. After a while, he moved to the piano and began to play. The melody that came out was something new, something he hadn't planned. It was slow, full of pauses, almost like breathing. He didn't think about the keys or the rhythm. He simply followed what he felt. He played until midnight, and when he finally stopped, he felt a calmness he had never known before. The next morning, when he arrived for the final rehearsal before Easter Mass, something wonderful happened. The choir greeted him with warmth. The same people who had once whispered about him now smiled and spoke kindly. It wasn't just because his music had changed, it was because he had changed. The conductor approached him before they began. "It's good to have you here," he said quietly. "The music feels alive again." Lorenzo smiled. "It's not me," he said. "It's the music itself. When they began to rehearse, the Pope joined them midway. The hall filled with sound, soft, reverent, and full of emotion. Lorenzo's playing carried the choir like a gentle wave, guiding them without overpowering them. The voices rose and fell beautifully, filling the grand space with warmth that felt like light. When the last chord faded, the Pope stood and said, "This is how heaven must sound." The choir remained silent for a moment, then broke into quiet smiles. There was no applause, no cheering, just peace. That was enough. After everyone left, the Pope stayed behind with Lorenzo. They stood together in the empty hall. The marble floor reflected the golden light from the high windows. "My son," the Pope said softly, "tomorrow when you play at the Mass, remember this feeling. The people will come not to hear you, but to find something in themselves. Help them find it." "I will, Your Holiness," Lorenzo said sincerely. The Pope placed his hand on his shoulder. "And remember, when pride returns, and it always does, sit at your piano and play slowly until it leaves again." Lorenzo smiled, understanding. "I will remember." That night, as he walked home, the streets of Rome seemed to glow. The bells rang in the distance, and the cool air brushed his face. He thought about everything that had happened in the last few days. He had come to the Vatican expecting to prove himself, but instead he had been shown who he really was. He realized something beautiful, that humility didn't make a man small. It made him free. When he reached his apartment, he sat at the piano once more. This time, before playing, he closed his eyes and whispered softly, "For you." Then he began to play the same hymn he had practiced with the Pope. The notes were soft, each one falling like a drop of water into stillness. The melody carried warmth, like a memory he didn't want to end. As he played, he felt a tear slide down his cheek. But it wasn't sadness. It was gratitude. And though the room was empty, he didn't feel alone. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that the old man's words were true. Music, when played with the heart, was a prayer that never needed to end. The morning of the Easter Mass arrived with a soft golden light spilling across the Vatican. Bells rang through the city, echoing across the rooftops as people began to gather. The streets were alive with quiet excitement, pilgrims, visitors, and locals walking towards St. Peter's Basilica, dressed in their best clothes, holding candles and small flowers. Inside the basilica, the air was calm but full of energy. The great chandeliers glowed softly, and sunlight streamed through the stained glass, painting the marble floors in blues and reds. The choir was already assembled, their robes pressed and their faces calm but expectant. The scent of incense hung in the air, light and warm. Lorenzo sat at the grand piano near the choir stand. His hands rested on his lap still. He wasn't nervous, though a gentle trembling ran through him. Not fear, but something deeper. It felt like standing before something larger than himself. He looked around the hall. The pews were filling quickly. Cardinals and priests took their places. The murmur of quiet prayers filled the air. Somewhere among the crowd, he saw a few familiar faces from the choir smiling reassuringly at him. The Pope entered last. As he walked slowly toward the altar, the entire congregation stood in reverent silence. He moved with calm grace, his white robes trailing softly behind him. When he reached his seat, he turned and smiled gently toward the choir, and then toward Lorenzo. It wasn't the smile of a leader. It was the smile of a teacher who trusted his student. The Mass began. The opening prayers were spoken, the scripture was read, and then the moment came, the first hymn. The choir turned slightly, waiting for Lorenzo's cue. He took a slow breath and placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then softly, the first notes began. The sound floated through the vast basilica like a whisper of light. It wasn't loud or grand. It was gentle, tender. Every note felt alive. The choir joined in, their voices blending perfectly with the piano. The music didn't just fill the space, it breathed with it. People in the audience closed their eyes. Some whispered prayers. Others simply listened, their faces calm and peaceful. Even the guards by the doors seemed moved. The Pope sat quietly, his hands folded, his eyes closed. He could feel it too, the change, the sincerity, the heart behind the sound. This was not the proud, sharp playing of the young man he had met days ago. This was something purer. As the hymn continued, Lorenzo forgot the crowd. He forgot himself. All he felt was the rhythm of the choir, the quiet strength of the melody, and the meaning of each note. It was as though something inside him had finally opened. When the hymn ended, a long silence filled the basilica. No one dared move. The sound seemed to linger in the air even after it was gone. Then, slowly, the Pope opened his eyes. He looked at Lorenzo and gave a single nod, small but full of meaning. The Mass continued, and Lorenzo accompanied each hymn with the same quiet devotion. His hands moved gracefully, not showing off, not demanding attention. Every chord felt like a prayer. The choir sang with newfound warmth, as if carried by his spirit. Midway through the ceremony during the Agnus Dei, something unexpected happened. A soft light broke through one of the stained glass windows, falling directly across the piano. The colors, blue, red, and gold, spread across the keys, and the reflection danced over Lorenzo's hands as he played. A quiet gasp rippled through the choir. It was as if the heavens themselves were blessing the music. But Lorenzo didn't notice. He kept playing, his face peaceful, his heart full. When the final hymn ended, the entire basilica remained silent for several moments. The quiet was not emptiness, it was reverence. Even the echo of the last note seemed to shimmer like light before fading. Then, one by one, people began to rise to their feet. But instead of applause, there was a stillness, a shared feeling that words couldn't capture. The choir looked at Lorenzo, some with tears in their eyes. After the final blessing, when the Mass was complete and the people began to leave, the Pope approached the piano. Lorenzo stood as he neared, lowering his head respectfully. The Pope placed his hand on Lorenzo's shoulder. "You played beautifully," he said softly. Lorenzo smiled faintly. "Thank you, Your Holiness. I only played what I felt," the Pope nodded. "And that is why it reached every heart here. You gave them something no sermon could." Lorenzo looked around the basilica, still glowing with morning light. "It felt different today," he said, "as if the music didn't come from me." The Pope smiled knowingly. "It didn't," he said. "It came through you. That is the gift you were given. When you forget yourself, that is when you truly serve." The words sank deep. Lorenzo didn't answer right away. He simply nodded, feeling the truth of it in his chest. As the Pope began to walk away, he turned back and added softly, "Now, my son, the heavens can hear you." The choir, still gathered nearby, heard those words. A few of them wiped their eyes. The conductor smiled quietly. Lorenzo stood still for a long time after everyone left. The hall was empty except for him and the faint scent of incense still in the air. He looked at the piano, the same one that had once been just an instrument to him. Now it felt sacred, alive. He touched the keys lightly, almost in gratitude, and whispered, "Thank you." Later that day, as the Vatican settled into calm, the Pope sat in his private study. His secretary entered quietly, carrying a stack of papers, but the Pope waved him off gently. "Did the young pianist play well, Your Holiness?" the secretary asked softly. The Pope smiled faintly. "He didn't just play well," he said. "He prayed through his hands." The secretary nodded, not entirely understanding, but sensing something deeper behind the words. Meanwhile, Lorenzo walked through the city streets, still in his simple black suit. The world outside seemed brighter, the air clearer. People passed him, some smiling, some nodding politely, but he barely noticed. His mind was still back in the basilica, hearing the echoes of the choir and feeling the peace that had filled the room. He passed by a small cafe near the river and stopped to rest. The owner, an old man with kind eyes, recognized him from the morning broadcast. "You were the pianist, weren't you?" he asked. Lorenzo nodded modestly. "Yes, I was." The man smiled warmly. "That music, it was something else. My wife cried. We both did. It felt real." Lorenzo smiled gently. "It was real," he said. "For the first time in my life, it truly was." He sat for a while sipping coffee, thinking about how much had changed in just a few days. He had come to the Vatican as a performer, sure of his greatness, ready to impress. But he was leaving as something else, a servant of the very thing he once tried to control. That night he returned to his small apartment by the river. He sat at his piano again, the same one he had practiced on for years. But now even this piano felt different. He ran his fingers across the keys gently, almost reverently. He began to play the same hymn from the Mass. The melody filled the room softly, wrapping around him like light. Outside, the sound of the river flowed quietly, keeping rhythm with his playing. He didn't think about anyone listening. He didn't care if the notes were perfect. He simply played, and as he did he smiled, softly, peacefully. The Pope's words echoed in his mind. Music is not in the notes, but in the silence between them. He understood now. The silence was where faith lived. The silence was where truth began, and somewhere, in that quiet little apartment, the humble sound of his piano rose like a prayer, reaching out into the night, simple, sincere, and full of heart. Weeks passed after the Easter Mass, but the memory of that day refused to fade. People across the city, and even beyond, spoke about it with quiet wonder. They didn't talk about the performance like a concert. They spoke about it as if something sacred had happened. Some said they felt their hearts open during the music. Others said it reminded them of what faith really meant. Lorenzo's name spread quietly, not because of fame or pride, but because people were moved by his sincerity. Letters began to arrive at the Vatican, thanking the Holy Father for allowing the world to hear such music. In the small cafe by the river, where Lorenzo often stopped for coffee, people would greet him warmly. But he never talked much about what happened. He didn't want to. It wasn't about him anymore. He continued to play at small churches around Rome. Each time he played simply, humbly. Sometimes only a few people would sit in the pews, old women clutching their rosaries, young children watching quietly. But even then, he gave everything to each note just as he had that morning in the basilica. The Pope, meanwhile, continued his duties, but he too carried the memory of that day with him. When he met with leaders, when he wrote his letters, even when he sat alone in prayer, he often thought of that young pianist who had once arrived full of pride and left full of grace. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight streamed through his study window, the Pope received a visitor, Lorenzo himself. He entered quietly, bowing respectfully. "Your Holiness," he said softly, "I came to thank you. You changed my life," the Pope smiled. "No, my son. You changed your own life. I only asked you to listen." Lorenzo hesitated, then said, "I used to think music was about control, about showing skill. But now I know it's about surrender. When I play now, I don't feel like I'm performing. I feel like I'm praying." The Pope nodded slowly. "That is how it should be. Every gift we have is not meant to lift ourselves up, but to lift others." Lorenzo looked thoughtful. "Sometimes I wonder," he said quietly, "why it took me so long to see that." The Pope smiled kindly. "Because pride blinds us. But once humility opens our eyes, we begin to see not with ambition, but with love." They spoke for a while longer about faith, about purpose, about the strange beauty of learning through mistakes. When Lorenzo finally rose to leave, the Pope said gently, "Go where the music takes you. But remember, the truest sound is found in silence." Lorenzo bowed once more and left. Months passed. The seasons changed. Rome shifted from the golden warmth of summer to the cool stillness of autumn. The leaves in the gardens of the Vatican turned shades of orange and red. The air grew crisp, and the bells of the churches rang through the narrow streets like silver threads of memory. One morning, a letter arrived for the Pope. It was from a small village in northern Italy. The local priest wrote that a young pianist had been visiting their church, teaching children to play hymns and organizing small gatherings of music and prayer. The letter ended with a simple line. "He tells everyone that his music began to breathe when he stopped trying to impress God and started trying to listen to him." The Pope read the line twice, then smiled faintly. He knew who it was. He folded the letter carefully and set it aside, whispering a quiet prayer for the young man who had once come to him with arrogance and now carried only gratitude. In that small village, far from the grand basilicas and shining halls, Lorenzo had found peace. The church there was small, with stone walls and creaking wooden pews. It didn't have the polished marble or the golden light of Rome, but it had something even more beautiful: heart. Each evening, villagers gathered there after work. Some brought candles, others brought bread or fruit to share afterward. The children would sit on the floor near the piano, their eyes wide, their feet swinging as they listened. Lorenzo would play softly, old hymns, gentle melodies that told stories of faith, of hope, of forgiveness. He spoke little during those evenings, letting the music carry what words could not. Sometimes between songs he would tell them about silence, how it teaches patience, how it holds truth. One evening, after a long day of harvest, an old farmer approached him. You play like you're talking to someone, he said quietly. Lorenzo smiled. I am, he replied. I'm talking to God. The old man nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. Then I think he's listening, he said. Word of the little gathering spread slowly, but Lorenzo never sought attention. He refused invitations to perform in grand places again. He didn't want stages or spotlights anymore. He wanted only to share peace through his music. Years passed. The Pope grew older, and his strength began to fade. He no longer walked as firmly as before, but his spirit remained bright. Even in his later years, he still spoke often of that Easter Mass, the day a proud pianist found his heart, and the choir learned what true worship sounded like. One evening, as the sun set behind the dome of St. Peter's, the Pope sat by his window, looking out over the city. He could hear faintly the bells ringing in the distance. He smiled and whispered to himself. The music never ended. That night he wrote one final message to be read after his passing. It was simple, just a few sentences. To those who serve through art, remember your hands are not your own. They are instruments through which heaven speaks. When pride falls silent, love begins to sing. Years later, when the message was shared, many thought of the young pianist who had once played for him. By then, Lorenzo had grown older too. His hair was touched with gray, his hands slower, but his heart as alive as ever. He still played for the village, though now the children who once sat at his feet had grown up and played beside him. One evening, as he finished a hymn, a small boy asked, "Why do you always smile when you play?" Lorenzo looked down at the child and said, "Because I can hear the silence listening." The boy didn't quite understand, but he nodded anyway and smiled back. As the night deepened, the stars shimmered over the little church, and the sound of the piano floated gently into the air, soft, sincere, filled with the warmth of a life transformed. Not far away, in the quiet halls of memory, the story of that Easter morning still lived. The tale of a pope who taught humility, a pianist who learned faith, and a choir that found the sound of heaven in their own voices. It wasn't a story of power or miracles or grand events. It was a story of listening, of learning, of small changes that make great differences. The music didn't end in the basilica. It continued in hearts, in prayers, in the hush of people remembering that moment when one man's pride melted into grace.